Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Barton. He's a professor of anthropology at Durham University, where he studies the evolution of primate brains and cognition, particularly visual cognition. Anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, anything to do with the brain and evolutionary perspectives on the brain. My main research interest is in studying how brains evolved.
Mm-hmm. Am I right that it focuses on primates, or have you looked at other animals as well?
Mainly primates, but it does also include a wider range of mammals as well. So conducting studies on, for example, brain size and explanations of brain size across the mammal phylogenetic tree. So we like to take as phylogenetically a broad approach as possible, really, so that we can draw very general inferences about how evolution has in general shaped brains, rather than focusing on just one area or phylogenetic. Primates are of particular interest to humans because we are a primate, and we're particularly intrigued by our own brains and how they've come to be the way they are, and to what extent and in what ways they're special. And so placing the human brain in its primate phylogenetic context is something that's of interest. But I'm also wary of being too narrow in my approach, because I think that as an evolutionary biologist, one tends to be interested in the big picture, the big patterns, in terms of evolutionary patterns and processes.
Right. So you mentioned before we started that you had a background in psychology. So did you start off researching humans and then only later transitioned into animals and evolution?
Well, my first degree was a joint degree in psychology and zoology. And so really going right back, I've always been interested in bringing those perspectives together. And biologists talk about proximate and ultimate explanations. And proximate explanations are the immediate explanations for phenomena, particularly behaviors and cognitive processes and so forth. And ultimate explanations are the explanations that are about how and why those particular mechanisms evolved. And they're not always brought together. So psychology has tended to operate independently of evolutionary biology, but of course our psychology is partly a product of the fact that we evolved over many millions of years, or tens or hundreds of millions of years even, depending how far back you want to take it. And our brains are products of those evolutionary processes, and it's our brains that are the proximate causes of our behavior and cognitive processes. So I've always been intrigued by what one approach tells us about how one can inform the other. On the other hand, evolutionary biologists are interested in big scale variation across the tree of life, in how organisms vary and what kind of evolutionary patterns and processes explain that variation. But when it comes to complex structures, which Darwin actually referred to as organs of extreme complication and perfection, which he thought of as being a challenge to his theory of natural selection, because it was hard to see how a mechanism as crude as survival of the fittest could explain something as complex and beautifully designed as an eye or a brain. Then biologists tend not, I'm generalizing here, but they tend not in general to have such a sophisticated understanding of the details of the mechanisms, of the proximate factors, as is the case within neuroscience and psychology. So I've always been very interested in trying to bring together the broad perspective that evolutionary biology can bring together with a detailed understanding of psychology and neuroscience, in order to make sense of this amazing organ inside our skulls.
Right. So an example of that might be like, why did you eat that? Proximately, because you're hungry. Ultimately, because you evolved this feeling of hunger because you need energy to survive, and so on.
Yeah, so both kinds of explanation are equally valid. They're different kinds of explanation. Why did you eat that? Because you were hungry, obviously. Why did you eat that? Because natural selection equipped you with survival instincts, which include hunger as an instinct, which ensures that you survive and pass on your genes to the next generation. So yeah, different sorts of question, but complementary sorts of question.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So how much of that is focused on very basic behaviors and motivations that are common across many animals, and then at what point with primates and humans does it start to diverge and you see things that are very unique to large brains?
So, you know, that's a really great question, and constantly we see an interplay between commonality, things that are in common across different species, and variation, and that's because natural selection is working on organisms that have an evolutionary history. All living organisms are related to each other. They all come from a common origin, so they all have, you know, some aspects of their mechanisms in common. But then natural selection works on variation and produces new variations that provide solutions to particular kinds of environmental problems. So if you look across all mammals, for example, all species of mammals have certain basic mechanisms in common, mechanisms of fear that enable animals to avoid, you know, being predated and eaten, and mechanisms of hunger that enable them to eat. And to some extent, these have share common pathways within the brain. So when one looks at the brains of different species of mammals, one sees a lot of similarity in the basic structure, and the basic components are pretty similar. But then you see all kinds of interesting variability as well, and divergences, which reflect the process of adaptation by natural selection. Different species have slightly different brains because they have different ways of life, and the structure and mechanisms of their brains are adaptations to those different ways of life. Some species are nocturnal, they come out at night. Some species are diurnal and come out during the day. And that influences the evolution of their sensory systems. The emphasis on, for example, the sense of vision versus the sense of smell and hearing. Some species echolocate and have amazingly sophisticated auditory systems that enable them to navigate through complex 3D environments in pitch blackness. And these are amazing adaptations, amazing mechanisms. We tend to think, and psychologists tend to think of the human brain as being some kind of pinnacle of evolution, but I think that that's actually not the most helpful way to see the evolution of the brain. It's not a case that evolution was heading in a particular direction and you know, up a kind of linear ladder towards perfection embodied by the human brain. It was producing lots of intriguing, divergent kinds of adaptations to different ways of life, and the human brain is just one example of that. We're just one twig on the tree of life. We're remarkably specialized in certain kinds of ways, but in some respects our adaptations are no more remarkable than those of any other species.
Mm-hmm. Are these adaptations all building upon the same, like, basic building blocks? Like, for example, the brainstem, is that more or less the same in many different animals?
Yes and no. So they are building on the same fundamental sort of organization. So, you know, if you go back to the origin of mammals, the first mammals had, you know, much smaller brains than many species subsequently evolved, but the basic components were pretty much all in place. And actually, ever since Victorian times, scientists have been trying to identify unique features of the human brain, unique structures. So there was a whole kind of controversy between and paper about whether a structure called the hippocampus minor was found in non-human species or any in humans. And Huxley said, no, you know, if you dissect the brains of non-human primates, you can see exactly the same structure. And to an extent, this debate was a reflection of the fact that some people have always wanted humans to be special, to have unique characteristics in some way. And so certainly in Victorian times, in Darwin's day, people were quite worried by the idea that we had this fundamental continuity with non-human species and were desperate to show that there was some kind of brain structure that made us unique, that wasn't shared with other species. By and large, you know, all the brain structures that you see in humans are shared across mammals. Now, what's different is the relative size of particular structures. So some structures have become disproportionately enlarged, and to some extent their connections. So natural selection has worked on different systems within the brain. But you don't really see any radical reorganization or the evolution of brand new structures. You see evolution building on what was already there and differentiating it in relation to, you know, the kinds of behaviors that were adaptive in a particular ecological niche.
Right. You mentioned earlier that we're not necessarily moving towards this pinnacle of like big brain,
Yeah.
but it's just adaptive to different environments. So, well, why is it that not all animals would benefit from a bigger brain?
Okay, so there's a number of elements in that question that are quite interesting. The first, just to go back initially to this idea of a linear scale. I mean, I think it's very important to make this point because still today in science, particularly in comparative psychology, and in evolutionary neuroscience and perhaps psychology more generally, there is still a tendency to view the process of evolution as a process of sort of progressive improvement. And in the case of the brain, a progressive expansion of the brain through time, leading to the human brain. But if you think about natural selection, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Natural selection doesn't care where it's heading. It just cares about which variants within a population leave most progeny at that particular time. And ways, you know, there are all sorts of different ways in which that might happen. So sometimes we see in some lineages of mammals actually decreases in brain size through time. And that comes to your sort of second part of your question, which is about why isn't it advantageous for everything to have a big brain? And of course, you know, to some extent, evolution is about trade-offs, and natural selection is about trade-offs between costs and benefits. And everything has a cost, and the brain's no exception. And we know that brains are particularly costly in terms of the amount of energy that they take to run. So they're highly metabolically expensive to run. That's a cost. You shouldn't, natural selection won't select for a larger brain unless the benefits outweigh the costs. If, for example, the amount of energy you can acquire through enhanced foraging skills exceeds the amount that you have to spend on the extra brain tissue. That's one kind of cost. There are also developmental costs. So larger brains tend to involve more extended development after birth, more elaborate processes of postnatal development, post-birth development. And that results, in general, in a relationship between the size of the adult brain and the amount of time it takes to develop and the amount of time that the organism takes to grow up, the length of its juvenile period. And that time that's invested in growing and maturing and wiring up a big brain is time that's lost to reproduction. Species that mature and start reproducing earlier potentially, could have higher reproductive success. So again, there's a trade-off there, and one idea is that the increased time before animals start to reproduce is offset by better survival once they've reached the age of maturity, so that they can go on to have a longer adult lifespan and a longer reproductive career. But all of these trade-offs mean that there's no kind of inexorable march towards larger brains, with one kind of exception, which surprised me when we found this. Because of the reasoning that I've just been laying out, I didn't particularly expect there to be any evidence for any general trends for increase in brain size within a particular group. But we did find that was the case in one group of mammals, and that is the primates, slightly contradicting everything I've just been saying. And actually in the primates, if you look at all of the different branches of the evolutionary tree or phylogenetic tree of primates, and you quantify the change in the size of the brain across the primate tree, what you find is that nearly all the branches see increases in brain size. There are a few branches where you see decreases as well, so it's not inevitable. But this does seem to be something peculiar, as far as we can tell, peculiar to the primate order, a particular order of mammals. And we're still kind of scratching our heads over why you see it, particularly in the primates, and what kind of evolutionary force might have led to that general trend.
So one of the hypotheses might have been vision, right?
Yeah. So this was really one of the most kind of satisfying elements of my research career, really, was the discovery of the link between the evolution of large brains and visual specializations for vision in primates. I mean, when I started out studying the evolution of the brain, I pretty much accepted the conventional wisdom, which to some extent is still quite pervasive, which is that there is some kind of general cognitive ability or general intelligence that species with larger brains have more of. And studying brain evolution would be a question of working out what is the correct measure of brain structure or brain size that reflects intelligence, and then finding out what kind of ecological factors that correlates with. So we could say what had driven the evolution of intelligence. And this kind of approach assumes that intelligence is a unitary kind of thing, that it's basically the same sort of thing in different species and in different groups of mammals, and that the way they vary is in having different amounts of intelligence. And what I've, to sort of jump ahead a bit to the overall conclusion, what we found is that the evolution of the brain is an awful lot messier than that simple story, and it's very satisfying in a way, because it makes a lot of sense. Biology is messy, and brains are extremely complicated. So in a way, thinking about it, there's no reason why there should be one sort of general explanation for differences in brain size. Now, when we look at primates, one of the things that early primatologists pointed out that makes primates different from other groups of mammals, when we look at the specializations for ecological niches that different mammals have, one of the ways that primates stand out is being highly visual animals. So primates, including ourselves, have eyes on the front of their heads, more so than any other species of mammal. This allows us to do stereo vision, so that each eye is slightly separate from the other. So there's a small distance between the eyes, which the brain can use to compute what's called a disparity between the signals reaching it from each eye. And that disparity gives the animal depth perception. So primates are good at stereo vision, they're good at depth perception, and they have particularly good hand-eye coordination and manipulative capacities. So it seems in primates, hand and eye have co-evolved. When neuroscientists mapped the different areas of the cortex of primates in terms of the functions of those different areas, and in particular the sensory inputs and sensory processing functions of different areas, they found that in monkeys, about half of the cortex of the brain is particularly involved in vision. So there are many visual areas, about 30 areas dedicated to visual processing in the monkey brain. As I say, about half of its cortex. So we've got, on the one hand, evolutionary adaptive specializations for vision. We've got, on the other hand, neuroscience telling us that a lot of the primate brain is processing these visual signals. And then thirdly, we've got the observation that primates have big brains. And this was kind of like just kind of something that occurred to me one day, that perhaps these things are related. And we tested that hypothesis in a fairly straightforward way by looking at the relationship between various measures of the visual input and measures of the size of the cortex and the whole brain. And we did indeed find a strong correspondence between those things. So big brain species have larger visual areas and are more visually specialized. So it was satisfying in the sense that all the different elements of biology from different areas of biology came together in a way that enabled us to make a prediction, test that prediction, and support it.
Mm-hmm. So once you find a finding like that, is the natural next step to start hypothesizing how exactly this relationship came about? Like maybe you need better vision to evade predators or find food or something like that?
Yeah, very, very much so. And we're still trying to tease apart the answers to that question. So one thing we did was look at different functionally distinct parts of the visual system. So very crudely put, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, part of the visual system is interested in where a stimulus is and in movement. And another part of the visual system is more interested in what it is and resolving fine detail about the stimulus. And this sort of crude functional distinction corresponds to different layers of a visual nucleus that is a kind of relay between the eye and the cortex. So we looked to see which of these different layers was associated with brain size and associated with ecological variables, and it turned out to be the part of the visual system that's particularly interested in resolving fine detail, which makes a lot of sense because it's in primates that we see the evolution of a specialized central area of the retina with a high concentration of photoreceptors, cone cells in particular. And it's those that project particularly to these layers of the visual nucleus that is part of the pathway involved in fine-grained acute vision. So again, everything kind of lines up. Now, what the selection pressures were is another question, and we're still not sure about that, but we do find that the part of the visual system that's associated with brain size is also correlated with being diurnal. So some species of primate are nocturnal and some are diurnal, and it's the diurnal species that in which there are more neurons in the part of the visual system that's involved in acute vision, and also with being a more having a more generalist diet, and particularly eating fruit rather than eating leaves or insects. And for eating fruit, color vision is very useful as well. So that might be a part of the picture. But to be honest, we're still trying to tease apart all of these things and understand how they all tie up.
So for fruit, maybe they'd have to be riper, so that makes sense. So how would you test hypotheses like these? Are you getting primates and then just experimenting with them and seeing how they respond to different visual cues?
I don't personally do experimental work. All of my work is comparative, kind of comparative anatomy, and correlating the anatomy with what field workers have recorded about the habits of those animals. So I these days I don't go out into the field and I don't go into the lab. I assemble databases amassing information on lots of different species, as many different species as I can get data for, where features of brain anatomy have been measured and we know something about how they behave in their natural environments, and essentially trying to put together all the different kinds of sources of information to make sense of it all.
Do you look at geographic factors as well?
Well, only to the extent that those geographic factors are influential in terms of the niche of the habitat and the sort of diet and so on that the species exploits.
Right.
Yeah.
I had one specific example in mind in asking that. Lynn Isbell seems to have found a relationship between primate vision and snake populations. So primates that co-evolved with snakes might have better vision. Yeah.
I know Lynn's work on that, and we've discussed it. I'm a little bit skeptical about the snake story. It's a lovely story, and I think she has found evidence that's sort of consistent with the idea that being able to detect and respond to snakes has been a crucial thing. And I have no doubt she's right that snake detection and anti-snake responses have been an important factor in some respects, but I don't believe that those things are likely to have required the kind of high fidelity vision that's associated with large cortical territories and large brain size, because I just don't think that that's the sort of task that requires a lot of computational power in the brain. It's basically you need to be able to spot a dangerous stimuli and react quickly to it. So yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'm not wholly convinced of that one myself yet.
Right. Do you think it might have anything to do with primates living up in trees, so that they're naturally up higher and might need more acute vision to be able to see things on the ground?
So one of the original theories about why primates evolved the traits that they have, including their visual traits and their grasping hands, was because they live in trees and need to be able to scamper about, and they might need depth perception to enable them to jump from branch to branch and judge the distance between branches and that sort of thing. The problem with that idea is that there are quite a lot of other species that have that sort of arboreal or tree living lifestyle that don't have the same adaptations as primates. So squirrels, for example, are extremely adept at scurrying about in the branches, making a living in the trees, but they have sides of their heads. They don't have stereo vision, and they don't have grasping hands in the way that primates do, and they don't have nails. They don't have nails. They have claws. So they don't have the same kind of grasping and manipulative abilities and hand-eye coordination and stereo vision that primates have. So that was why Matt Cartmill came up with a different kind of explanation way back in the 70s, and it's still an explanation that has a lot of currency, which is that it's the combination of living in trees and being a visually guided predator. So Cartmill pointed out that many small-bodied species of primates depend on a diet of insects, which require you to be able to move very swiftly and grab prey, and then tear it apart, manipulate it, and so forth. So that's one explanation. Another explanation more recently has been that it's not an insect diet, but it's a diet of fruit and flowers, and that's led to these adaptations, because you need, again, if you eat those sorts of things, then having good manipulative abilities guided by stereo vision in order to sort of take apart the fruit and find the nutritious parts and so forth, will have selected for those traits. But any of those hypotheses only explain the sort of characteristics that were found in the first primates, and which are to some extent common to all primates. They don't explain the subsequent evolution of the brain and the expansion of brain size in many lineages of primates. For that, we have to look to other factors.
Right. So I came into this with prior knowledge of two lines of research. One was Isbell's snake hypothesis. The other is Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. Hoping we could talk about that, and then maybe that might be linked to vision as well.
Yeah. Robin Dunbar, in a series of papers, showed that the size of the brain, and in particular the size of the neocortex, seemed to be most closely associated with social factors, sociality, in particular the size of the social group and perhaps the complexity of the social group. And he, in common with some other researchers who had sort of like suggested the hypothesis, he really tested a hypothesis that was out there and then elaborated it. Argued that it's really social life that is most cognitively demanding. That all animals have to find something to eat and avoid predators in fairly similar kinds of ways, but what distinguishes primates, or many groups of primates, is their social complexity, and it's the challenges of complicated social relationships that have led to large brains. Now, I was interested in that idea, but I was also trying to relate it to what neuroscience told us about how the primate brain deals with social information, such as facial expressions, and various kind of social stimuli.
Right, that's the initial point at which they come together.
Yeah, so for example, Leslie Brothers had suggested that there are specialized regions of brains in monkeys that are specialized for handling social stimuli, but particularly in the visual domain. So if you think about how you observe what's going on around you in your social life, a lot of it requires you to be able to visually process complicated sequences of social interactions. And so I try to tie up the two kinds of, again, bringing together the neuroscience and psychology with the evolutionary biology, and make a connection between something as crude as brain size and more kind of sophisticated, detailed aspects of neuroanatomy and the design of neural systems. And for a long time, I was an advocate as well of the social brain hypothesis. In recent years, I've become much less convinced. Certainly that it is the all-embracing explanation for everything you need to know about the evolution of the primate brain. I certainly no longer believe that.
Yeah, if there's one thing I've learned from this podcast, it's that there's never a single answer to any complicated question.
And repeatedly, what we've seen when we've looked at different groups of mammals or even different groups of primates is that, on different twigs of the tree of life at different times, in different habitats, one sees different kinds of adaptations. And that's as true of the brain as it is of any other aspect of the animal's adaptations. And that's really, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense.
So we talked earlier about how brain size might not always be a general marker for intelligence or for function. Like between men and women, for example, men have larger brains and bodies, but we aren't smarter. So what is it that compensates for that? So if there's a smaller brain but an intact ability, I'm guessing it might have something to do with functional connectivity.
Yeah. So I suppose one way to answer your question is to ask what brain size, really means, and what is the significance of brain size. And in recent years, there's been quite a lot of criticism of the idea that one can just, again, assume a simple relationship between the size of the brain and intelligence, and then look for correlations between the size of the brain and ecological factors. Because what you really need to know is which particular systems of the brain, which regions and systems of the brain, which connections have changed, and how that may be reflected in brain size. So in this view, brain size is really just a kind of almost incidental side effect of the changes that are happening to specific neural systems. And you could get changes that might not even be well reflected in differences in brain size. I'll come back to men and women in a minute, if you like.
Sure.
But to give you one example of this, in relation to our work on the effects of being nocturnal versus being diurnal species, coming out at night or during the day, as I mentioned, species that forage during the day have more elaborate visual systems, because visual systems can, buy you a lot more in adaptive terms. If there's more light around, there's more you can do with it. Whereas nocturnal species, there's a bigger payoff to elaborating other senses, like the sense of smell and the sense of hearing. And so what we see is that there is no, or at best, a very slight relationship between whether a species is nocturnal or diurnal and the size of its brain. Because on the one hand, in nocturnal species, one set of systems has expanded, and the other set has decreased, and the opposite in diurnal species. So brain size is a very imperfect indicator of what's going on, beneath the surface. And sometimes what's going on beneath the surface in evolutionary terms isn't at all reflected in the size of the brain. So we really should be looking at at the specific systems. Now, having said that, obviously a feature of the human brain is it is enormous. It's ridiculously enormous. And, you know, relative to our body size, which you mentioned, you know, and it is important to take account of the fact that larger bodies tend to be associated with larger brains for the, you know, fairly straightforward biological reasons that things scale up together. And having taken account of that, the human brain, even though we're quite a large body primate, our brain is ridiculously large. So it's about 3 times larger than the brain of other species of great ape, even though our body size is not much different. So there's definitely something to explain there. And we're still working on, you know, what that explanation might be. We're getting some intriguing findings. Just to come back briefly to your question about the difference between the male and female brain, essentially, you know, when you've controlled for the size difference, there's very little evidence of any difference in brain size. And as far as I'm concerned, no evidence at all for any cognitive differences that survive control for a whole range of confounding factors. But also, you know, it partly brings me back to the question of what intelligence is anyway. And in terms of a comparative concept, looking at differences between species, I've come to the conclusion that intelligence is really not a useful concept for understanding cognitive evolution and brain evolution, because it's a very vague concept that is a kind of loose, well, put it another way, the mechanisms that people associate with intelligence are very poorly defined. So they talk about things like flexibility and capacity to innovate, but there's very little sense of how those are tied to specific biological characteristics. And I actually think intelligence is kind of just an emergent property of specific capacities. So to go back to what I was saying about the evolution of the human brain, what I think ultimately, you know, what will explain the evolution of the enormous brain that humans have is a fairly specific set of biological and neurobiological processes that enable us to do all sorts of things. So some people call that general intelligence, but I don't think that calling it general intelligence really tells you anything about what it is. And I've been interested recently in trying to pin down, you know, what is special about the human brain apart from its size, and how size relates to structure and particular neural systems.
Is one of those facets of intelligence memory? Are there also similarly sized differences between the hippocampus of either humans or primates and other animals?
I mean, there was a recent study that suggested that the human hippocampus is unusual. And so, but the problem is that the hippocampus is involved in a range of cognitive processes. And at the moment, I think there's a bit of a re-evaluation within cognitive science of what we mean by memory, and whether memory is a thing, whether it's a collection of different processes. So, for example, you know, there are traditional distinctions between episodic memory, one's memory for events, and procedural memory, one's memory of how to go about doing things. And some of these distinctions are breaking down as generally a kind of a re-evaluation of what memory is and what comprises memory, and to what extent memory is lots of different things. And I don't think I've come to the conclusion, although I can't, you know, say that there is any one piece of evidence that supports this, but it's my hunch that there isn't a memory system in the brain, that memory is a property of different brain systems, and that those brain systems are specialized for particular kinds of cognitive process, of which, you know, memory is just one facet. So I don't think it'll be the case that memory per se is what distinguishes the human brain and human cognition, although in some way it may be related.
So I guess there's two types of memory. There's the sort of long-term storage memory,
Yeah.
and then there's also the working memory in terms
Yeah.
of being able to abstract some information and then manipulate it all inside your head.
Yeah. But again, you know, I think that even that distinction between long-term memory and working memory might not be quite so clear-cut as has traditionally been assumed. I mean, there's some evidence that non-human apes have phenomenal working memory that at least matches that of humans. So it's quite hard to do these experiments in ways that make the tasks entirely comparable for humans and non-human species. But at the moment, there isn't clear evidence that working memory is what distinguishes humans.
Do you know of any research looking at temporal dimensions, like whether humans have a greater capacity to think about the future?
So people have tried to do this, and again, it's tricky to design conclusive experiments that show that a particular species is not able to complete a task that humans are able to complete. But there have been attempts to look at whether, for example, non-human apes will plan for the future, whether, for example, they will select a tool that's appropriate to a task that they have learned that they're going to encounter in the future. And there's some sort of weak evidence that they can. My hunch is that something about humans' linguistic capacity has transformed our ability to think about the future and to plan, so that we will ultimately find that there are differences of that sort. And I think it's, you know, I think it's very likely, as I say, that it's something to do with language, but it may turn out that language is based on more general capacities for manipulating and comprehending sequences of information. So as I'm speaking to you, I'm stringing together sentences in you know, a fairly flexible way and more or less coherent way, where the different elements of the sequence are combined in order to make a coherent sequence. And humans seem to be particularly good at that. And people have tended to assume that that's because we have an extremely large cortex, and they've tended to locate the language system that humans have in regions of the cortex. And again, I think, you know, what's really interesting is the way that idea is beginning to break down, or at least to be only a part of the story. And to go back to our work on the evolution of the brain, as I said, people have assumed that the human cortex, the cortical regions, are the kind of the bits that have expanded most in brain evolution and that are the seat of intelligent behavior, and bits at the back of the brain are more primitive and haven't changed much, to go back to a question you raised earlier. And this all seems to be wrong. It seems like subcortical regions, other parts of the brain, have changed at least as much as the cortex, and to some extent the two have changed in concert with each other. So instead of it being the case that, you know, we've added parts to the front of our brain, to the frontal areas of the cortex that are that give us language and so forth, and planning abilities, that actually a whole range or network of regions throughout the brain have changed together and support those kinds of capacities. And there's an area at the back of the brain called the cerebellum, which turns out to be particularly fascinating in this regard. Now, for many years, neuroscientists have known that the cerebellum, although comparatively small, it's only about 12–15% of the volume of the human brain. It actually contains far more neurons than the cortex does, about 4 times the number of neurons as are found in the cortex. And what we've discovered is that it's also the part of the brain that expands most rapidly in our recent phylogenetic over the evolution of the great apes, including ourselves, and hominin species more recently. So far from the cortex being kind of the pinnacle of evolution, we kind of turned the brain upside down and found that this area at the back of the brain is at least as important. And what's really interesting about that is that there's also converging evidence from cognitive neuroscience that one important function of the cerebellum is in managing complicated sequences and learning sequences of actions and in comprehending sequences. And of course, sequences and understanding sequences are also the basis of planning for the future, because you can't plan for the future without being able to simulate in your head a sequence of possible events. That's what planning is. And it seems the cerebellum is really important for that. So again, this has been really satisfying because it's tied up, converging strands of evidence from different fields, from cognitive neuroscience and comparative neuroanatomy, and put those things together and is coming up with a slightly new story, which is enabling us to make new predictions. Like, the cerebellum, we believe, is going to prove to be a vital component of the language system. And that's something that hasn't been really much examined before.
That's exciting. I remember learning about the cerebellum, or not much about it, because I think I remember hearing studies about, like, if it was removed, despite containing like most of your neurons, there's not that much of an obvious behavioral difference. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think these studies can be quite hard to interpret. So we do know that lesions of the cerebellum do cause all sorts of deficits, and deficits in managing sequences of information is one kind of deficit. It's true that there are some remarkable cases where people, there's one person who was born with almost no cerebellum, who seemed to be able to get by. But we also know of cases of microcephaly where the cortex is massively reduced, just a very, very thin layer. And again, people sort of seem to manage to get by. And one thing we do know about the human brain is it has a remarkable plasticity in being able to sort of reallocate functions from one region to another. But even so, there are deficits. There's still a lot we don't understand about plasticity and the limits of plasticity in the face of these kinds of major anatomical issues.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So that brings me to development, because these specializations, areas of specialization we've been talking about, exist over evolutionary spans of time, but are they also there from the very beginning and they kind of just stay that way throughout development? Or is it only that in like adults you'll see these systems fully developed, and as you go younger it's more meshed together?
Well, so I mean, I suppose one answer to your question is that there is always a close link between the process of individual development or ontogeny and evolution. So the way that evolution produces adaptations is by adjusting the process of development in order that new adaptations can be produced during the lifespan of the individual. So For example, one finding that we've made is that the evolution of a large cerebellum in the adult is associated with a protracted period of development in the juvenile. The cerebellum undergoes a lot of development after birth. So that makes sense. The way in which you evolve a larger cerebellum is to increase the period of development after birth so that it can grow and become wired up. Development and evolution are intrinsically tied up. Some people have taken that to mean to suggest that development provides some kind of constraint on the evolutionary process, that evolution works most easily by making very simple changes to schedules of development. But I think it's more complicated than that. There's actually evidence that natural selection can reach right down into the processes of development and make very fine tweaks that can result in quite small scale changes, or it can make major changes. It can sort of revolutionize the schedule of development with sort of massively ramifying effects, but it can do all kinds of things.
So the small additive changes seem intuitive, but do you know of any examples of those revolutionary developmental changes you mentioned?
When it comes to the brain, that's really going to be really tricky, because if you change too much at once, it's going to be more likely to lead to something that just doesn't work. It's going to totally disrupt the function. If it's a very complex system, which the brain is, and you mess about with it in too crude a way, then you're more likely to mess it up than you are to produce something that works very effectively. So generally, we don't see sort of massive revolutions of that sort. We see over, tens of millions of years, the addition or accretion, if you like, of successive changes in developmental processes that lead incrementally over large evolutionary time spans to what we call macro evolutionary changes, large scale patterns of evolutionary change, and ultimately, differences in the complexity and size of the brain that we see in a human compared to a very small mammal like a shrew, for example. But that's taken, tens or even hundreds of millions of years to achieve a fine-grained incremental change. And it takes us back to Darwin's kind of dilemma about, how could you explain these incredible, organs of extreme perfection and complication? And the answer is it takes an awfully long time and small incremental changes that are gradually scaled up across the tree of life.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great full circle place to stop. And I think we covered a lot, so this was very informative. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.